Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. There might be a few other people join us. My name's Amy. I'm from the Rock Island Public Library. Catherine is here from Davenport Library, I noticed as well. I will say we won't meet as for a presentation in September. Our next presentation by Kevin and crew is in October, and I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Amy, and I appreciate you, all of you coming here to listen to these series of talks. And I'm excited. Obviously, this is one of the topics near and dear to my heart. I'm an Army Reserve officer, and I'm my reserve side, the First Army Command historian as well. So, man of many hats, as some of you may know. But so I want to kick it off here, and this is the foundations of First Army, and really. What we know of a modern army today really started with the things that came out of World War One. And First Army, obviously, as the name says, was the first field army that we had established in this new modern era. And so I wanted to start off with this image here, showing that basically this was came out in July 4th, 1918. Basically talking about how we were no longer, an isolationist nation, that we had to stand up and be a part of our allied nation here, or our allies, that I should say here, and showing the British, French, and then obviously the American forces here. But moving on, so First Army and General Pershing didn't start right away, as many of you know that the United States and the American Army were, as our allies called us, kind of Johnny come latelys. We entered the war very late in the conflict. The war started for the European allies, or the Europeans, in 1914. We officially declared war on 6th April 1917. And like you see here, picture of Pershing to the left. The first American soldiers under Pershing's staff arrived in France in 1917, June 13th, 1917. Unfortunately for the Allies, this would be the large part of the American forces for quite some time. The United States, we had downsides following the Spanish-American War. We had just gotten out of the border conflict with the what we know as the punitive campaign, policing the Mexican-American border. And so our forces were really not really not ready for a large scale offensive or a large scale war like this. And so we had a lot of building to do. But like you see here, 50 officers and 100 enlisted soldiers came with General Pershing in June of 1917. The very first soldiers that came would be the newly formed 1st Infantry Division. Prior to this point, the United States Army was built largely of regimental affiliation. So you have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd example, United States Infantry. These units were combined to make divisions, and then larger, eventually, multiple divisions into corps going on. But one of the things I wanted to point out here is that while we arrived in June 1917, since we have a shared interest in the 4th of July with the French and our revolution, there were a lot of ceremonies. There was a parade that the 1st Infantry Division marched in, and Pershing was self-professed not a very good speaker, or he didn't like to speak openly in the public. And so he actually had Colonel Charles Stanton, one of his staff officers, speak to a crowd at Lafayette's grave. And Lafayette was basically had helped, bring together the United States and the French government in the Revolutionary War. And you could read his quote here, but basically the words that he mentioned was basically, "Lafayette, we are here," and basically saying that we are coming as Americans back to help our sister in France. The quote was commonly referred to as Pershing saying it, and he later on said, "Well, I wish I could have come up with such a great speech and words, but no, it was Colonel Stanton that delivered it." So fast forwarding to it really takes us almost a year to really get our forces together, get trained, and get them into the front line. So the first real American combat was launched in March of 1918, and this was in large part the Russians had left the war in 1917, and so the Germans shift a lot of their combat divisions to the west to help fight in the battles of the Western Front and try to win the war before the brunt of the American forces could be brought to theater. And so there was a massive spring offensive in the spring of 1918, and the British and the French were screaming for American forces to come to the front lines. And like we'll talk about a little bit more here in a minute, Pershing was fighting, parsing out American units, giving them the French and the British because we wanted to fight together. So the first, one of the first American battles was 28 May 1918, Battle of Cantini, where the First Infantry Division fought very valiantly. June 1st through the 26th, the Battle of Belleau Woods, which is where the 2nd Infantry Division fought, but most notably the 5th and 6th U.S. Marine Corps regiments fighting at Belleau Woods. The picture off to the right shows American soldiers advancing during the Battle of Cantini. 3rd Infantry Division, as you can note, these are 1st, 2nd, 3rd Infantry Divisions. Obviously, all the first regular regiments, regular divisions that were formed, seeing combat here to begin with. So the Rock of the Marne was their nickname ever since World War I because of their actions at Chateau Thierry, where they defended a piece of land near the Marne River and really helped to defend the German advance at Paris. So you can see the red circle down here to the left where Chateau Thierry is, and where the 3rd Infantry Division defended against the German advance towards Paris. It successfully helped stop it. So with that being said, now in comes the discussion about the fight that the Americans were having with their allies. So you can see the chart to the left and the number of British expeditionary forces, how they slowly rise over time. And then you can see the American expeditionary forces from April 1917 just skyrocketing, up to about 2 million soldiers. And then the chart to the right shows the black line shows the Allied soldiers, and these are riflemen, basically soldiers that are on the front line pulling the trigger, in comparison to the Germans here. And so the Americans were finally putting, soldiers on the front line. We're putting reinforcements up front. But what was happening here was that the British and the French wanted these soldiers coming into theater to be put into British and French units. And we did that to a degree, like, for example, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd Infantry Divisions, and then later on the 92nd, 93rd Divisions and 91st Division were all parsed out and given to French and British units and fought under their command. But it was largely in small parts. And this was known as amalgamation, where the British and the French wanted the American forces to fight under them. Well, Pershing, along with President Wilson's blessing, wanted to keep the American forces together as a whole, that we would fight under American command and lead our own basic offensives. And so really, as we're getting around about 800, 900,000 soldiers in theater, in about the June, July timeframe of 1918, the idea comes forward that in order for the American Expeditionary Forces, or known as the AEF, to be an equal with our allies, we needed to start forming field armies. The AEF, our Expeditionary Force, was really a framework in order to bring American soldiers into theater. And it really did not have the staff power, did not have the really the combat or the ability to lead troops into combat. It was more of a logistical network. And so all of our allies had, like, for example, the British Expeditionary Forces had field armies that fought under the Expeditionary Force command. And so for a number of different reasons, including being on par with our own, our own allies, General Pershing creates the American First Army. And what you see to the left is the General Order, American Expeditionary Forces General Order numbered 120, officially laying out the staff for First Army. And in a certain case, you'll see some of these staff officers being, the who's who of where the Army will go and going into World War II. Lieutenant Colonel Drum here, who is the chief of staff and is the workhorse of creating First Army, he will actually go on to become Lieutenant General Drum and will lead First Army just before World War II starts. Also, Fort Drum in New York is named after him, where First Army did a lot of their exercises during that time. But yesterday, August 10th, 1918, the 103rd birthday today, or I'm sorry, yesterday, was the date that First Army was officially formed. And so General Pershing, doing the unusual tactic of co-leading both the American Expeditionary Forces and First Army at the same time, would basically lead them at the same time. And so what you see here to the left is First Army's General Order Number 1, published July 31st, 1918. And I just had this slide showing some of the officers here. Putting faces with names always helps. And so these individuals would help basically build First Army, but would also help build and reinvent the American Army. Coming out of the punitive campaign, the American Army was really in a sorry state. We didn't have a great number of troops. The National Guard troops that we'd had access to from the States were typically poorly trained, poorly funded. And so you see that the organization, the training, the expertise that's coming out of First Army here, all the cream of the crop of officers and soldiers are rising in First Army and would be later parsed out in many cases to other field armies and other units throughout the American Army to help build them going forward. One of the interesting cases here too is Colonel Parker Hitt. He would become the Signal Corps officer, but he was the Army's leading cryptologist. And so a lot of the code breaking, a lot of the development of American codes going forward was started by Lieutenant Colonel Hitt here at this time. Ironically enough, his wife, who obviously stayed in the United States, was self-trained and oversaw training by Lieutenant Colonel Hitt here. Did not have a college degree, but she was the leading cryptologist in the United States, trained by her husband here, and was actually one of the first women that was hired as a contractor to help do cryptology in the United States. Anyway, going forward, so on August 10th, sorry. But going forward on August 10th, 1918, First Army's formed. Its temporary headquarters is put at Chateau Thierry, and the American troop levels now in theater are. Hang on 1 second here. I'm getting a lot of feedback here, but there we go. The American troops in theater now in France as of June 30th are about 860,000, and that number seems deceiving. That these are soldiers on the ground. These are not necessarily soldiers that are trained. And one of the flaws that you see coming out of the mobilization in World War I was that soldiers are receiving almost minimal, if no, training in the United States. They might have a uniform. In certain cases, they're not even trained, or they hadn't fired their weapon. So General Pershing is now having to deal with that in France. And so a lot of these units that are showing up in France are having to go through extensive training, basically a second basic training, and then are going through training with the British and the French as to what trench warfare actually looks like. So there's this delay behind when units are showing up in the field and then actually or showing up in France and then actually getting to the field. But there was an incredible just explosion of troops, and like that previous chart that we saw, in troop numbers arriving in theater. And so, it's good in one way, bad in another way, that we're having to train all these guys now a second time. So troop shipments in June of 1918 were about 276,000. July of 1918, about 307,000. And so you see all the divisions that show up here. that are listed out there in that same time frame. And so we're rapidly expanding, the size of the American Expeditionary Force here. Now, if you look at the picture to the right, and in our current day with COVID, you think about that. One of the major impacts that Pershing was having to deal with in these soldiers arriving in theater in France was influenza. And as things would progress, they start wearing masks. But you see troop ships like this showing up in France, and 10, 15, 20% of the soldiers are immediately taken off the ship and put into the hospital, and are being treated for influenza. And so there was a dramatic pull on Pershing's forces, just in dealing with the instances of influenza on the soldiers who are arriving in the theater. And so uh, he's having to deal with that as well, and figuring out and sending messages back to the United States: stop sending me sick soldiers. Um, so now that First Army is formed, and we're training as a field army with about 550,000 soldiers in First Army now. The rest of the about another 500,000 soldiers by August are being trained by the British and the French. So Pershing's initial concerns is he's still fighting amalgamation. Particularly the French command, like General Foch, you see the picture to the left here, are really saying, okay, great, Pershing, you have a field army now. We need troops. They are, they're not in the field yet, so take these divisions and give them to us. And so there was a very contentious relationship between Pershing and General Foch, who is the French supreme commander, and basically the Allied supreme commander in that case too. And during one of these meetings where Foch is actually telling him to break First Army up and send the units to the British and the French, Pershing basically stepped back and said, "No, I'm not doing it." And he writes later in his diary that he had the conversation was so heated that he actually had thought about stepping up and hitting Foch in the face. Now, Pershing, with his very calm demeanor, didn't, and ends up walking away. But out of that conversation comes a negotiation. Now that Pershing has about 500,000 soldiers in the field in a field army, he proposes to General Foch to allow them to carry out an offensive at the San Miguel salient. And again, a lot of back and forth goes between Pershing and Foch, and he finally approves the offensive at San Miguel, and approves the Americans leading this as an independent command. And so this would be the very first American-led offensive. And right up basically until the day before the offensive, Foch is now telling Pershing that he wants him to abandon the San Miguel offensive because of other gains elsewhere on the front, that he doesn't think that it's necessary to take the offensive or take the salient here. And again, back and forth ensues, and Pershing basically says, "Fine, I'm going to take my soldiers and sit it out," and Foch finally allows him to do this, but under an agreement that he has to be the San Miguel offensive has to be shortened, and he has to be disengaged and moved up to the Meuse-Argonne salient or sector by September 26th. And Pershing says, "No problem, we'll get it done." Little did he know how much of a difficult process that would be. But now by September or the end of August here, it says there's 1.4 million soldiers in theater, million American soldiers. And like I said, First Army would have about 550,000 effective. So this is an overall map of France. Oops. The yellow area is France here. You can see England up at the top. The dark red line here is the front line. And you can see this huge bump in the line, and that's known as the San Miguel salient. And the Germans had well entrenched this position. It had been basically salient in the Allied lines for well over a year. And Pershing said, it wanted to take the salient and prove that the Americans were worthy fighters. So 18 miles deep, 24 miles wide, and like I said, dominated really by the Germans since 1914, but since really 1916, after the Battle of Verdun, the Germans had really entrenched it. And the problem with the salient is that, from this position, with good artillery, you have a way to actually shell a huge number of forces. And so, having it protrude into that line or into the Allied line was really a pain for the Allies. Plus, the town of San Miguel held special meeting for the French government here, and because of how well reinforced it was, this was really considered a rest center. This units come here on both the German and the French side, and get their quiet time in the front lines, and then move on to other areas. Uh, and mostly the fighting that was going on here was artillery duels and some gas fighting, aerial dogfights every day, like it says. But on average, the French and the German lines were less than about a half mile apart. So this is what the battle takes or looks like. The American Expeditionary, or I'm sorry, First Army would have its 550,000 soldiers set on basically one side of the salient there. They would have operational control of colonial French forces on the other side of the salient, and their idea was to cut this bulge in the line, meet at the town of Vignes, and then head to the east or to the northeast. So, like I mentioned, is that there were a lot of these people that we would recognize from World War II that were making their names here. The initial battle plans that were devised for San Miguel were actually, in large part, built by Lieutenant Colonel George C. Marshall. He would become the American the American Army Chief of Staff in World War II. Basically leading all American forces in World War II. Eisenhower would be under him. And he would design this assault, and then he would actually, as we'll talk about here in a minute, design the withdrawal from the San Miguel offensive and movement up to the Meuse-Argonne. About 9 American divisions were assigned the attack, 1 French division on the western side there with the colonial forces, and then an additional 3 French divisions in support. So the battle takes place or starts here on 12 September at 0100 hours. They would have a barrage that would last about 4 hours long, which was unusually short for offensives in World War I. Typically, you see, day or days, weeks, even in some cases, of artillery barrage. The General Pershing and in this case, Lieutenant Colonel Marshall wanted to have the element of surprise, and so they had chose for this very short artillery barrage with an all-out attack. So First Army would begin its advance at 0500 there. Surprisingly enough, the First Corps, especially of First Army, would overrun enemy trenches very quickly. By about 1200 hours, they'd captured those 3 villages, and most of their objectives for the first day were already accomplished by about 12 o'clock in the afternoon. All the roads leading out of the salient were clogged with the retreating Germans. You could tell that basically a lot of these guys were talking about, a lot of the Americans were talking about how the Germans just did not seem to have the same will as they'd had earlier in the war of fighting. And so you'd see a lot of retreating columns, a lot of abandoned gear, front lines. The Americans really had difficult terrain to fight over, but the German forces just didn't seem to be in it the same way as they had been before. Most of the First Army objectives stood on their second day. When you look at a World War I trench, you don't look at like a single trench line. You look at multiple trench lines going back. And so the Germans had, dug in, had machine gun pillboxes, and really well fortified positions. So some of these later trench lines were more heavily defended than the initial trench lines, allowing for this what we know today as the defense in depth. By September 15th, all offensive operations were halted. First Army had accomplished all of its objectives. The salient was now eliminated. So you go back to the map here, that the this black line with the dashes on it was where it started. The solid black line here is where First Army had achieved its objectives by September 16th. So the salient had been successfully eliminated, and now Pershing had to look to the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The significance of the Battle of Sandman was this was the first American-led offensive, like I said, of the war. It was the largest battle that the American Army had ever fought, with over 500,000 soldiers involved in it. Nothing in the past had ever paled in comparison. The AAF general staff and soldiers really proved themselves worthy. The Allies started looking at us differently at this point. There was still a lot of banter going back and forth that, we were still Johnny come latelys, and that it was the Germans didn't have the heart to fight, but they saw that there were American units that were really achieving the objectives and pushing their way, taking this 4-year-old salient. We captured nearly 16,000 German prisoners, over 450 artillery pieces. We had anticipated 50,000 casualties, American casualties, and suffered fewer than 8,000. So while still a heavy price, it was far less than we had anticipated, and were typical for the war. So Sandman was the red circle there, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive was this blue circle up here. And so it doesn't seem like very far. It's about 60 miles. But imagine taking the population of the Quad Cities and moving them just a little bit further than Iowa City, and doing that in the course of about 3 days. And if you did that, you had to take everything that they would need to survive on those 3 days and go straight into an offensive following on. So the Sandman Offensive took place 12 to 15 September. We had to disengage, have our lines replaced by the French, and then pull back and move up to the American salient or sector of the Meuse-Argonne offensive here, which would take place or would start in 26 September there. So it was definitely quite a feat. I'm not going to lie that it wasn't a pretty thing. There were issues. There were very few roads that were available, and as would be expected, that it starts raining during this movement. So roads were turning into quagmires. There were descriptions of soldiers seeing mules, because we didn't have all, truck or vehicle transport. We were still using horses and mules. Soldiers described mules disappearing into muddy roads that they were so bad. And General Marshall had, Lieutenant Colonel Marshall this time had, devised this movement from San Miguel up to the Meuse-Argonne sector. And he was so worried that it wasn't going well at certain times, he actually went out and started helping direct traffic to try to help it move it on its way. The Meuse-Argonne area or sector was very important to the German defenses. If you look at this map here, basically the main rail hub for all German forces in Belgium and northwestern or northern France here, ran through Sedan right here. And so if the Americans were able to get cut or go forward and cut the rail lines at Sedan, all the German forces north and west of their position would be without supplies or without rail lines bringing in supplies. So you can see the offensives that the Americans and the French to our left were taking place, and then the British offensives that were taking place simultaneously. So it was an all-out front-wide offensive that started roughly on about the end of September. The image to the right shows the red line showed all the different trench lines that the Germans had created. The black dots are all pillboxes or fortified positions that the Germans had built during that time to help slow any advance during the attack here. And obviously the Argonne Forest, which the attack goes through, was heavily wooded in certain places, and so it was a very difficult terrain to assault through. Overall, the plans for the Meuse-Argonne offensive took less than 3 weeks to coordinate. Like I said, that there were now, or it starts on the 26th of September. 5 of the 9 American divisions that were slated to fight the Meuse-Argonne had not seen any combat experience. Had not completed the AEF's training program. 3 of the 9 had never seen enemy combat before. And then 3 additional did not have their own artillery brigade supporting their fight. So I always like trying to associate quotes. General Pershing says it was thought that reasonable to count on the vigor and aggressiveness of spirit of our troops to make up for their lack of experience, basically. And he's saying this because of the British and the French at the same time, saying that, hey, you guys don't have the experience, these green soldiers, you should really put them under, British and French command where there are experienced soldiers. And Pershing, even through this whole time, in between the San Miguel and Musaragon offensives, is saying, no, the Americans can do it. And this is where he's saying that the vigor and excitement the Americans have will take us to it. And the image to the right shows some of the American forces, and you kind of see the muddy road there that's leading from San Miguel to the Musaragon area. Like I said, here's a road jam or a traffic jam that's taking place somewhere between north of San Miguel, northwest of San Miguel. And so you can kind of see what some of the problems would be. So there was basically traffic all the way from all the way from San Miguel to the Musaragon area. And so there was supplies that weren't showing up in the right places, units that weren't supposed to be in the front line of march and we're getting to the front lines. And so battle plans had to be shifted. So it was a mess, but we worked it out. About 220,000 French soldiers had to withdraw at the same time to be replaced by the now 600,000 American soldiers of First Army. So it was a confusing place nonetheless. I liked this quote too by Sergeant Joe Rizzi of the 110th Engineers. After a tiresome, weary march through shelled roads, devastated villages, and destroyed forests, we advanced to the Argonne Forest, arriving and relieving the French at about 3 a.m. of September 26th, 1918. Unfortunately for Sergeant Joe Rizzi here, he would actually start on the offensive about 4 hours later. So no rest for the weary here. So this was the battle plan here on September 26th, going from the 77th Division over to the 33rd American Division and being flanked by the French on either side. Basically just an all-out frontal assault through those multiple lines of trenches that you see or that you saw on that previous map. The attack would start at 0230 hours. The bombardment would, again, was a short bombardment. It would start at 0230 and last until about 0530, which when Sergeant Joe Rizzi, having about 3 hours worth of sleep, ends up stepping off with the rest of the American forces. The infantry advance under a rolling barrage. So as the infantry is moving forward, the artillery barrage is moving forward in front of the Americans, and this was a tactic that the British had used quite extensively through the war, trying to provide cover. If nothing else, throwing up clouds of dirt and smoke from the shells going off, but also at the same time, hopefully, cutting barbed wire in their front and any fortifications that were away. So going from 26 September to about 2nd of October, most of us, I think, have heard about the Lost Battalion, which there was an operational pause in our advances. And then we started an offensive again. And when the offensive was ordered, not all the units had gotten the advance or the order to advance. Well, unfortunately, 9 companies of the 77th Division did advance and got swallowed up in a hole that the Germans had in their line in the Argonne Forest. And so they were surrounded, and about 5 days, they were fighting the Germans and fighting, unfortunately, the Americans, because the American artillery and American units that were now in the front lines were hearing all this fighting taking place. And so artillery started shelling the area, and the only communication that Major Whittlesey had were carrier pigeons. And so I think they had a total of 3. And one of the ones that Charmaine, which was the pigeon's name, he sent back telling them where he was and saying, for God's sake, stop the artillery fire. You're shelling your own men. But despite that, after about 5 days, the Lost Battalion was broken to by American forces and relieved. After basically being without food and in certain cases water, short on ammunition, they had very few machine guns and less than 500 rifles. but they resisted 7 coordinated enemy attacks, artillery, trench mortars, and flamethrowers during that time. 65% of the soldiers started of those 9 companies were suffered as casualties during the fight. But it's very well known. There's a movie about the Lost Battalion made by, I think, A&E a number of years ago. Pretty decent movie for Hollywood. But Major Whittlesey would be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor during the war, but he carried a tremendous amount of guilt for what he felt was lost so many soldiers. So the attack, again, after another operational pause, is ordered forward. General Pershing relinquishes command of First Army, choosing to only command the American Expeditionary Forces. Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett takes over the attack and presses it forward. So basically, from 11 October for about another month, the American forces were just pounding away at the Germans and going through some really heavily fortified positions. The town of Sedan here, pictured to the right, was the American objective there, where the rail lines went through, like I said. But again, it was a very significant town for the French. It was also a fortress town. And on 1st November 1918, First Army launched its final assault with the 5th Corps trying to break through the German line. And in this case, or by this time, the Germans were in full-on retreat. There were stories of German machine gunners being left behind just to slow the American advance, to allow for the Germans to retreat out of the area. Like I said here, 4 November, the Germans are in full retreat. The 1st Division by 7 November are on the heights overlooking the town of Sedan, and victory is in our grasp. And there's starting to be rumors of a negotiated armistice, but something that is unusual happens here. And there's a great book that I believe the Rock Island Library and the Davenport Library both have, if I remember correctly. But it's the 11th month, 11th day, and 11th hour. So despite the negotiations that were taking place between the Allies and the German command or German leadership, the attacks were still taking place. And in part, Pershing was one of these that was pressing the attacks, and he was really a forward thinker in a lot of cases. And while no, I don't think that it's necessarily right that we were fighting up to the very last moment, but Pershing saw the armistice as a temporary thing, and he saw that the armistice was a German tactic to slow the Allies, to allow them to retreat back to a new defensive line and to reform. And Pershing said, no, we have to keep fighting them until this war is over, or else we're going to fight another one. So very forward-looking commander, he was called on the carpet after the war for saying, why did you fight up to the very last minute of the war? And he said, well, I was fighting to try to end the war, not to just have an armistice, that would stop fighting. Because the armistice at the time was not a declaration of peace. You have the Treaty of Versailles and the other peace negotiations that come out after that. And so peace wasn't permanent. Peace wasn't assured at this point. It was just a stop from fighting. Taking place at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month. So a very, significant time in set by somebody, a staff officer, back looking at his watch. So the significance of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, it became now the largest offensive that the United States Army had ever taken place in. First Army would have over 1 million soldiers that had come through its command during the offensive. It was so large that a Second Army was formed and would take some of the burden off of First Army and shorten its line. The fighting was so intense and so fierce that divisions that were being put into the line would be chewed up in several days and be pulled off the line to have a new division put in. So our casualties were much higher, and it was a much more difficult fight. But it led to the collapse of the Imperial German Army all across the front. And with the capture of Sedan, it really led to the conclusion of fighting to the north and the west for the Germans. There was no hope of resupply at that point. So the Fifth Corps earned the name the Victory Corps because they were the front runner within First Army, leading to the end of the war. Another real significant piece of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, while tanks and airplanes were used during the Saint-Mihiel offensive, the Meuse-Argonne really was the thing that taught the American Army how to use these things. During the Saint-Mihiel offensive, we didn't have enough tank crews, and so some of the tank crews were French, manned by French crews, which led to some interesting problems too, where if you're in a tank, you have to be told by the ground crews around you where to go and what's going on there. So the infantry around you are your eyes. Well, those are Americans who speak primarily English, and unfortunately, the French crews that were chosen for a lot of these tanks were French and only spoke French. So there was some communication issues in that. But by the Meuse-Argonne, majority of the tank crews and the airplanes and the artillery crews were all American soldiers, and so this was really our first chance and our way to develop doctrine going forward on how to fight a mechanized war. And I know Bob's still on here, and he could probably tell you for an hour about the tank warfare and what we learned from it. But this talks about First Army today. So again, another significant piece to this is that you see, again, like I said, the who's who of World War II really get their first combat experience here. And Marshall would write later on about his experiences and seeing the death and destruction, coming out of the Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne, and the difficulties that he had in the moving from one sector to another sector. And it's he wrote about how he used those experiences in his planning going into World War II, along with MacArthur, all these other big leaders, so that we would know about in World War II. So over 1.2 million American soldiers would be involved, with 380 tanks, 840 airplanes, 2,780 artillery pieces. The overall cost would be killed with 122,000 wounded Americans for the offensive. The French would sustain a combined 70,000 casualties. Germans would have 450,000 personnel involved, with 28,000 Germans killed, 42,000 Germans wounded, and another 56,000 captured. Now, one thing that I didn't say about the Meuse-Argonne offensive is that in between Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne, Pershing was crying to the United States for reinforcements, saying, "Hey, I need more reinforcements, and I really need about 90,000, experienced soldiers to reinforce the front lines." There were 90,000 soldiers available to him in France. The unfortunate part about it, only about 45,000 of those 90,000 soldiers were ready for combat. The other half were suffering from the effects of influenza. And believe it or not, that influenza really reared its ugly head just through the Saint-Mihiel and into the Meuse-Argonne offensive for the Americans. And in order to be treated in the hospital, you had to be suffering from a temperature of 103 degrees or higher. Otherwise, you'd be sent back to your unit and had to suffer through it. So the total soldiers that died from disease, largely influenza, were almost equal. And actually, I think it was just slightly higher than the actual soldiers that were killed in combat. So influenza, really had its impact on the American soldiers in First Army. Like I said, I know PowerPoint through Zoom can kind of be dull sometimes, but I really like to show, what the soldiers saw. So Sergeant Maximilian Bowl of the 79th Division said of the Meuse-Argonne, said that that evening about dusk, I saw an unforgettable sight. I'm lying down in the field. In front of me, to my left, I see a hill and the battered town and fortress of Montfaucon. An attack is in progress. The soldiers are advancing up the hill with rifles and fixed bayonets in hand. They are all filtering through the ruins slowly but steadily. Shells are falling and crashing amongst them. Smoke and debris and flying debris dot the hill. It is a gripping scene, a dramatic war picture, and here I am actually seeing it. And then down below is actually a picture of Captain John Falconer of the 315th Field Artillery Regiment. At a given time to the second, we poured a terrific rain of our heavy, high explosive shells into a wood-filled with enemy machine guns. I'm sorry. Killed or ran out of the way of the entire crew. It was a magnificent affair. One of the other things that, or one of the other individuals that had experience in the Musargon was actually a Captain Harry Truman, who would go on to become vice president and then president after President Franklin Roosevelt died or passed away. And he had an account that I didn't put on here, but was something that I thought was very telling to his mindset. Was when they got word that the armistice was announced, they had stopped firing. He was an artillery commander. They had stopped firing their guns and decided to sit out the rest of the war. Well, he describes that a few shells come in and land amongst his battery, killing and wounding several soldiers. And so he ordered his men, with the most stringent of commands, to get back on their guns and expend all of the ammunition that they had, up to the very last moment, where they actually had timed the last shell flight that it would land and explode before 11 o'clock sounded. And so, just kind of showing his mindset at the time. But the Musargon was something that tested the American Army and First Army in this case, but really proved and had impact on a lot of these people that we see throughout history. This was a quote that it's actually inscribed on the Montfaucon monument by General Pershing, but he said that the Musargon Offensive, in which over 1 million American soldiers fought, was suddenly conceived, hurried in plan and preparation, complicated by close association with the preceding major operation, yet brilliantly executed and prosecuted with an unselfish and heroic spirit of courage and fortitude that demanded eventual victory. It stands out as one of the very great achievements in the history of American arms. And so, really for the Americans, Musargon was its crowning achievement. It was hard fought. The American soldiers really were up against, a well-seasoned enemy. And after they'd broken through the lines, were chasing an enemy and trying to bring this war to a conclusion. But again, there would actually be an inquiry following the war that questioned why, there was a soldier that died at 10:59 a.m. Just a minute before the end of the war. And there was an inquiry about why all these soldiers had died the very last day and the last hours of the war. And, Pershing, fervently defended his decision, as well as a number of British and French commanders, decisions to fight up to the very last moment. Because, again, he said that if they didn't continue taking the fight to the enemy, that they would know that they weren't serious about succeeding in the war. So with that said, I'm shocked. I was planning on going overtime, but I didn't want to keep everybody for an hour and a half or 5 hours that I could talk about First Army. Are there any questions that I can answer? Anybody about First Army or these initial San Miguel and Musargon offensives? Okay. Well, Ms. Sissel, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about First Army and to talk about the American-led operations here at San Miguel and Musargon, and I really appreciate all of you taking a little bit of time out of your day to listen to it. And I hope that it was interesting and educational in that.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
And we'll see you in October.
Yeah, we hope to see you all in October. My counterpart, Mark Struve, will be talking about the next one. And going on into next year, we're going to be doing a series on Rock Island Arsenal and the local community throughout history. So we hope that you guys will join us next month, and then going forward into the history of Rock Island as well.
Yep, we look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.